want to thank all 5 panelists for their very thoughtful and insightful presentations. So we have some time, shall we say about 15 minutes for Q&A? Yeah? Shall we split the difference? Okay, 10 minutes for a Q&A. So as before, there is a microphone in the middle of the room. Please line up, and it's too high. Okay. No, sorry. Okay. Talking on the microphone. Okay. All right. So please introduce yourself and state who you're addressing your question to.
Okay. Thank you very much. Great panel and very successful conference. So thank you for panelists and organizers. My name is Salih. I am an assistant professor at Virginia Military Institute. I have 2 questions. One for Yusuf. My question is, how do we know that it is not social desirability bias driving these results? Because if someone reads me a surah from Quran, I will, and it's a Muslim country, I will be hard pressed to go against it. You know, even if I might think otherwise. So how do we know that it's your results come from actual change of opinion versus social desirability bias? And I also would push back against framing your argument as a limit of social change, because your results actually suggest a lot of variation for support on equality for inheritance. And you know, as we know, Mr. Akio also discussed this, the support for certain aspects of Sharia evolved over time. Maybe some concepts that were supported a century ago are no longer supported, or vice versa. So I would caution against framing it as a limitation, but it's just my 2 cents. My other question is for Lindsay. To what extent is this translating the service intellectual support? Because your results clearly show that Ennahda lost a substantive amount of support, and what I'm thinking is that the clientele services are going to its core constituency, right? So some core people, perhaps who were part of the network, benefit from these services, but perhaps it becomes more exclusionary in that sense. So to what extent is this about expanding support to new constituencies, or to what extent is it about keeping a core constituency alive? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Why don't we go ahead and take all 3 questions, so we'll have the panelists respond to them as they wish. Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, mine is addressed to Yusuf. I'm concerned that the question of inheritance can't be decoupled from the question of the male's responsibility to use part of that inheritance for the family, which the woman does not bear. And I want to know, have you done it, or are you thinking of doing any way you can go back and revisit the question and not decouple those 2 questions that are related? I'm especially concerned because I noticed the one other issue on which you said there was an inegalitarian bias was the issue of, are men better, better suited to be political leaders? It seems to me there may be some overlap between these questions.
My question is also to Lindsay. I was in Tunisia most of the last 10 years, and I had the feeling that Nahda suffered from actually having too much, 75% you said, access to the, people in the rural areas to ask demands, but not being able to deliver on those demands. So there's a big difference between reaching the member of parliament and asking for help, which I think Nahda was able to offer, because you mentioned it has offices everywhere. But are you able to deliver on those? Because if you don't, then you automatically lost that person. He's gonna be angry that he had access but nothing happened, or he didn't deliver. So I don't know if you had an opportunity to look into how many of those requests were actually delivered upon. That's my question.
Okay, so I guess Yusuf, the first question was directed at you. Shall we start with you?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, Salah. And I think actually, thank you very much for giving me and my co-author now, I think, another way to kind of bolster our findings, because I think actually the defense that we have that is not social desirability bias is that other treatment that we have, the bureaucratic treatment, wherein we don't actually reference the Quranic passage. And so I think that's actually a very good defense for it not being social desirability bias. So I will be making sure to include that in my paper, so thank you for that note. In terms of not framing it as a limitation, I mean, my read of this and my read of how Nahda has approached it, you know, because Nahda again has been very willing to kind of talk about, you know, certain compromises, always giving kind of a religious rationale for their compromises. There really is no religious rationale for adjusting. You know, I mean, you know, it's so explicit. And it's in the Quran.
There is a rationale.
I mean, if you want to go against the Quran, I guess, but you know, the way that I think most people kind of read it.
It's not going against the Quran. The rationale is what Fazlur Rahman suggested: reading the Quran in context and understanding that that particular hukum realizes a certain intention, which is bringing justice to that society in that social conditions, and we can bring it. That's an interpretation that's out there, suggested by some Muslim scholars and agreed by some Muslims, but yes, it's not the mainstream interpretation.
I mean, I would go so far as to say that it's not just the mainstream. I'd say that there was an overwhelming consensus I would go so far as to say I don't think there is any other issue that there is more of a consensus on than this issue, and so I think it's really.
There was consensus on slavery too, but things change, so it can change. It does not. I'm not saying it's not the majority opinion. Obviously, it is, and people have the right to opinion. But to say there is no other way to understand this can be challenged from Islam.
Okay, fair enough. I think the vast majority, nearing the entirety of you know, mainstream Muslim scholars would say that this would be akin to a capitulation, not a compromise. And I think that is where you know, the issue of a limitation comes in.
But you are not a theology scholar, you are a political scientist.
Fair enough, yes.
You deal with public opinion. So
yes.
Public opinion can fluctuate. So for you, it's not a limitation.
Well, no, but...
theology, it can be a limitation. I'm
well,
sorry for...
No, fair enough, no. But what we're saying is, you know, clearly those who are in this survey feel that, you know, this is a bridge too far. You know, at least significant, right? So we're reading okay, framing, that's on us, but I think it's a fair framing based on the data. And certainly we don't get into normative issues. I'll leave that to my esteemed scholar colleagues, you know, and other scholars as well. Real quick on the second question, we don't have any data on men's responsibility. I think that's a really important point. I think it would be a great follow-up survey. You know, whether it is, because yeah, that is very much, it's a coupling, right? Because you know, this inheritance is coupled with men's responsibility, and then, you know, obviously, you know, that issue, I think that's where there has been, you know, perhaps a bit more evolution, as Mustafa had mentioned.
If I might say, that relates to Muslim's point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're allowed to change your position on the men's responsibility, then on the justification of social context, then it would also then open the door to being able to change it on the inheritance as well.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Can I just add something there? It's not strictly that for every male, for every
No, absolutely, yes. No, that's an important point. In fact, Yusuf al-Qaradawi actually had a paper saying that there are many instances when it's equal inheritance. In fact, there are some instances where women get more inheritance than the men, right? It's just this matter of sons and daughters, you know. And
yes, so it's
absolutely.
in the case of dependent children.
Yes, yeah.
Parents, by the way, the mother and the father inherit equally. So gender is not actually the critical factor.
Yeah.
It's who needs supporting.
Yeah.
So people have argued that egalitarianism has to be wedded to notions of justice as well. But so Lindsay, there was another question directed at you.
Yes, thank you for these questions. Seth's question had to do with whether I thought that Ennahda's constituency service was primarily to its own base of supporters or to others, and related to that, if it was successful in providing constituency service and drawing voters, why didn't it win in 2014? In the paper, I have a very detailed table in which I look at every constituency service interaction, and I look at who the person voted for in 2011 and who they were planning to vote for. And there, the evidence is pretty clear that, well, yes, it's true that some voters were part of Ennahda space. They voted for Ennahda, they got some help, and then they were going to do that again. Ennahda was the only party in which there were any observations of, we could call it a voter conversion, where the individual voted for a different party, then they got help from Ennahda, then they were planning to vote for Ennahda. There were no cases where the person voted for any party and then was helped by a different party and then changed their vote. So, I think there's evidence that there was sort of this constituency service that did transform a little bit the voter base. But then, of course, something else happened after 2012, and that was the emergence and engagement of Nida Tunis in the electoral sphere, and so, and then many things changed, of course, over those 2 years. So that's my thinking on that. And then the second question, just having to do with, this same question, why was Ennahda not successful electorally? I think there are many different factors that contributed to that, but it does seem to be the case. Oh yes, you also asked about whether these requests were successful. It's one thing, as you noted, it's one thing to be able to make a request of an MP, and it's quite another thing to get that issue resolved. And there is a variable in the survey that asks whether it was successful, there was a small N. I don't believe that the successful resolution of the problem was necessarily a factor in shaping or attracting voter support. There is something to be said as well about symbolic responsiveness, or the idea that at least there's someone that I can talk to there that cares about my issue. But again, this organizational capacity gets back to whether a party can do something, because it's not just whatever resources an MP can get from the state, it's also how they can use their friends who have businesses who might be able to hire someone who needs a job, or their friend who is a physician, these kinds of things. But I think more research on that would be important, and of course I'm also very disheartened by the recent developments in Tunisia that make that impossible.
Okay, go ahead.
Just a thought. You're quite right. A lot of people, of course, perceive it that way in a more literal sense, and that's extreme, and that's fine too. But I think the other discussion should be, whatever we understand as the requirements, the commandments of Islam, should it be the law of the land for the nation? So that's a different question. Muslims are not supposed to eat pork. Most of them don't eat pork. I don't. But whether it should be a law of the land, that's a different question, right? So, to give an example.
No, I think that's fair, but I don't want to put thoughts into the head of Ennahda, but and other kind of conservative individuals in Tunisia, but I think they would imagine it as a very slippery slope from some initial compromise to a point where it is legislated equality, right? To where you cannot actually have.
That would be a dictate too. So you will have the right to. Actually, the more you legislate, the more you get into these culture wars. So minimizing the role of the state and allowing people to choose their own ways, and a more libertarian solution, I think, is the only way out. Yeah, Israel is a good model in this sense for Jews. Yeah.
But imposing Jewish law on secular Jews.
It is, but I'm saying at least it allows secular Jews to have their own ways of life.
Well, that does bring us to the end of our fourth panel and final panel for the day. Shall we have another round of applause for our presenters?